Punk music presents us with a very interesting aesthetic problem. At least on the surface, what punk seems to be trying to do is to present the audience with something disturbing, something that puts them off, something that they might find ugly. In general, what music, especially music of the 70s, tended to approach was a kind of smoothness, a kind of plasticity that demonstrated artistic skill, that demonstrated studio skill, that demonstrated some kind of refinement. The music might have been loud, it might have been exciting, but it was meant to also be polished. Punk is a denial of that. In fact, part of punk's aesthetics seem to be to go deliberately against that notion, the notion that music should be accessible or should be something that we can listen to in the background. Punk attempts to force itself into the foreground, in part by being harsh, in part by being somewhat, at least from a traditional point of view, ugly. Now, keep in mind that for the most part, for the first generation of punk, whether we're talking about the beginning of New York punk or the beginning of British punk, what we're dealing with is a music that is in some ways a throwback to the 1950s and the early 1960s. The progressions are all familiar, and yet in some way, it's not a music of nostalgia. It's a music that rejects nostalgia, even while it uses the tools that we might associate with nostalgia, references to old rock chordal cliches, for instance. So how does this work? What is it that we're dealing with if we're dealing with an aesthetics of the ugly? But why must aesthetics deal, in particular, with the beautiful? To some extent, this might seem self-evident, and yet there are historical reasons that we ought to investigate. In some ways, this goes back to Plato. Plato postulated that there were three transcendentals. There was the good, there was truth, and there was beauty. And these were convertible, meaning that if something was truly good, then it was also true, and it was also beautiful. If something was truly beautiful, then it was also true, and it was also good. And if something was truly true, it was beautiful and good. And these were the primary concerns of a human being. These are the things that we ought to study. This then opens the way to the three main branches of philosophy. Logic deals with the truth, ethics deals with the good, and aesthetics deals with beauty. Now, it is true that logic will deal with both truth and falsity, but it treats the false as though it were a negation of or an absence of the truth. Ethics will deal with evil, but only as the absence of the good, and aesthetics will deal with the ugly, but only as the absence of beauty. So the primary concerns, the positive terms, the things that have a positive, a true existence, would be truth, good, and beauty, whereas the false, the evil, or the bad, and the ugly have a negative existence. They're simply the absence of the positive terms. In this way of thinking, an aesthetics of the ugly would be a kind of contradiction in terms. The only function for the ugly would be to as a material resistance within an artwork that must be overcome by the art's form. And indeed, that's one of the mainstays or the main concerns of an aesthetics of beauty. We're interested in form, how the material is formed to create a beautiful semblance, a beautiful appearance of something, right? And so art requires beauty in that sense. And yet, clearly, things are not as simple as that. This is a painting by Jenny Saville, and for most people, this would be considered not something traditionally, at least, beautiful. Something about the bodies, especially in their particular configuration, the emphasis on the flabbiness, in this case, of the bodies, the fact that they're not posed in such a way as to emphasize beauty, that much of this is meant to confront our understanding of what is beautiful and what is not beautiful. Ugliness clearly has an important part in human experience, and even in experience in general, that is, experience for non human entities. This is clear if we define the ugly as that which does not conform to an ideal or does not conform to a quote unquote good for us, a value for us. In this sense, even my dog can experience the ugly, since for him the ugly will be anything that actively contravenes his values, eating, having a nice walk, getting a treat, and so on. That anything that interferes with our ideal is somehow the ugly. Here we have a painting by Francis Bacon, You can see that behind the man whose face is obscured, you have a rack of meat that has been butchered, and perhaps those are, I can't remember if those are supposed to be intestines or what, alongside the meat. There's something disturbing about this kind of painting. It's not an aesthetics of beauty. If this is still art, and I think we would be hard pressed to say that it is not, then this is a different notion of what art involves. This is a confrontation as opposed to an attempt to assuage or an attempt to uh, reconcile us to the world. So, art is about experience in various ways. Much of art concerns beauty. Much of art is an attempt to give form to the messiness of material. But some art, for instance, the art that we're looking at now, is meant to do something else. It's meant to aliven our sense of the world, that something about the ugly connects us more closely to the world. Some people, some thinkers, for instance, Theodore Adorno, even suggest that ugliness is prior to beauty, that the beginning of art was an attempt to reconcile ourselves to a world that frightened us, to a world that seemed hostile to our approach to it. And therefore, when we sought beauty, it was an attempt to give form to formless nature, to a nature that resisted us, to a nature that haunted and threatened us, to a nature that we found dangerous and frightening. Now consider this painting, also by Jenny Saville, a painting called Entry. As you can see from the mass of blood around the young woman's nose, and if you look carefully, you can see that her left eye is collapsed in due to the damage to her skull. This is a woman who is in the morgue. This is a corpse that we're looking at. The dark black hole of the bullet wound sucks us in. There's something almost abstract about this painting. In one sense, we can almost see something abstractly beautiful about it. Just the swirl of color, the pallid tones, the mix of dark and light. And yet, as soon as we remind ourselves of what it is that we're looking at, we're reminded of the ugly. We're reminded of the repulsive. We're reminded of the thing that we can't help but find somewhat disgusting. And that's a notion of the ugly that goes back to at least a philosopher named Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin said that we're curious about things that we find disgusting because we're somewhat afraid that we are truly disgusting, that we are identical with the things that disgust us in some manner. So if someone spits on the sidewalk and we're disgusted by the phlegm on the sidewalk, that's because we too produce phlegm. That's because we can identify with that level of disgust, and perhaps that's part of us as well. Here, what we are seeing is a woman that's reduced to meat. And it's hard not to realize that we too are meat. As much as we try to disavow that, as much as we try to remind ourselves that we live lives of the mind and lives of the emotion, when it comes down to it, we are simply pieces of meat. And that's not all we are, of course, but there's an element there that should disturb us, that should disgust us, that should upset us. And part of what this painting, it seems to me, accomplishes is that it reminds us of this thing, this part of us, this thing that we carry around with us that is upsetting, that is disgusting, that is disturbing. So let's return to the issue of punk, and specifically the Sex Pistols. In the accompanying analysis video to this video, I discuss the Sex Pistols song Bodies. And you'll see in that video, in my discussion of the lyrics, that that Johnny Rodden also talks about the body as though it were meat. Of course, most of the time when he's talking about meat, and bodies as meat, he's attributing that to other people. But what he says is that he is not an animal, that he is not merely meat. And this is the dichotomy we often find ourselves in. That on the one hand, we have to acknowledge the base physicality of our being, and that there's an element of ugliness to that. The body has, no matter how beautiful it is, has plenty of ugliness along with it. The mere fact that we defecate on a daily basis is an element of ugliness that we can't simply run away from by denying that we do it, obviously. The body decays. As gorgeous as it might be now, it is continually falling apart, and eventually it will fall apart totally, and you will die. And part of what the song Bodies is doing is it's both acknowledging that, but disavowing it, denying it, resisting it. It acknowledges it in other people and yet can't face up to it on its own. Now, his delivery in that song in particular, almost more than many of the others, is incredibly confrontational, incredibly angry, because he's dealing with this very basic existential problem: the fact that we die, the fact that we fall apart, the fact that we're put on the earth and then gone, and it seems as though there's nothing. Right? As the Sex Pistols put over and over again, as their slogan goes, there is no future, no possible future, not for the country, not for the world, not for the individual. And that is ugly. So the ugliness in art is part of the experience of art. It's part of the way that we face up to experience. If art is meant to be a kind of heightened experience, a kind of engagement with otherness, that otherness isn't simply something that's divorced from me. It can also be me as other. It can be facing up to the parts of myself that I'd rather not face up to. And so the ugly is indispensable to art, not just as a dissonance that must resolve, not just as an ugliness that must be somehow sublated and overcome within the larger appeal to form. Rather, the ugliness is the unassuaged. The ugliness is that element that can't go away, that you can't look away from as much as you might want to look away from it. So it provides an appeal to reality, because there's plenty in reality that is ugly. Adorno believed that beauty came out of ugly because the world was frightening. And so ugliness is all around us, and we find beauty in it in order to make sense. Kant said something very similar. Kant said that our experience of beauty, in particular, not the sublime, but the beautiful, is because it gives us a sense of mastery over nature, because nature is frightening. The world is frightening. Reality is frightening. And so beauty gives us this sense of mastery. But the ugly reminds us that we're not in control, that there's always something else to resist, something that challenges us. And so in that sense, a second portion of, or a second element to ugliness is that it offers a critical resistance to sameness. That what beauty does is it tries to make everything into a kind of clear, coherent sameness, and the ugly resists that. It refuses to be part of it. Third, it refuses to collapse content into form. Ugliness resists form. It attempts to maintain its own particularity, to pull away from the sort of nice fairy tales that we tell ourselves. And then fourth, melody, or ugliness rather, examines the way that things fall short of our ideals. We like to think that we are these beautiful bodies, that we are these beautiful minds, and yet we're falling apart. Things don't cohere the way that they should. Things don't meet up to our ideal of them. And then finally, ugliness reminds us that aesthetics is a way of understanding the world, all of it, not just the ideal, not just the beautiful, but art is a way of facing up to experience, and experience is not only experience of things we find enjoyable, but also of things that we find frightening, disturbing, and ugly.